This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. Welcome back to Tell Your Story Alaska. Today is going to be a more of a fun episode. We're going to do some history today. A very unique flight that took place in Alaska and how it nearly triggered World War III. So I titled this episode, How the Aurora Borealis in Alaska Nearly Triggered World War III. It's a fascinating story that my brother, who kind of knows everything, who put me onto it. And it all started on October 14th, 1962. Started when a U-2 spy plane piloted by a man named Richard Heiser flew the U-2 known as the Dragon Lady over Cuba. I know we're talking about Alaska, but it all starts in Cuba. This U-2 flew over Cuba, taking 928 photographs, proving to the U.S. intelligence that 700 Russian medium-range ballistic missiles had been established in Cuba. President Kennedy and his team discussed responses ranging from full-scale attacks to various diplomatic actions. Ultimately, they chose to quarantine the island of Cuba from any Russian ships from coming to the island. This clever option was chosen because it did not involve any loss of life, whether American, Russian, or Cuban, and it was in the hopes it would lead to de-escalation of this situation. So we're in the throes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the most prominent events of the 1960s is when this fateful flight took place. On October 22nd of 1962, Kennedy announced to the public of the existence of these missile sites. The public announcement made clear that if the Russians launched any of these nuclear missiles, that the United States would respond devastatingly against Russia. At the time, the U.S. had a nuclear missile sites in Turkey and in Italy called the Jupiter missiles, which were very close to Russia and were ready to launch anytime. This announcement basically made clear to the world, if you mess with us, it will cost you more than you will be willing to pay. It is the ultimate peace through strength strategy, or sometimes called the mutually assured destruction. The response was that Kennedy's actions were acts of piracy. He ordered his ships to ignore Kennedy's quarantine of Cuba. By October 25th, the U.S. had declared DEFCON 2. DEFCON is a term used by the Pentagon to indicate that the threat level the country faces and the readiness for a potential response. DEFCON 2 means the next step to nuclear war, an extremely high level of alertness where nuclear weapons are made ready for launch. Nuclear-armed B-52s were constantly in the air to launch its nuclear payload at any time. Naval and ground stations were also armed and ready to launch. So what would happen when the U.S. ships required inspections of Russian cargo ships coming to Cuba? The scene had been set. It would only take a spark to ignite nuclear war. By October 26th, just 12 days into this brewing conflict, Kennedy concluded that only a full invasion of Cuba was the only way to deter Khrushchev and communicated this to him. Khrushchev did not expect this from the young Kennedy. His top advisor had said that Kennedy was too young, too intellectual, and not prepared for decision-making in crisis situations, too intelligent, and too weak. In contrast, Khrushchev had woven his way up through the landmine-ridden land of the Russian political hierarchy, proving his capability for political chess games. He believed that Kennedy would put up a fuss about the weapons, but ultimately capitulate. So Khrushchev was not expecting this kind of threat from Kennedy of a full invasion. This is an underestimation of the young president he would later regret. Now, to add to these tensions, on the morning of October 27th in 1962, Rudolph Anderson took off from McCoy Air Force Base in his U-2 spy plane, and as he was conducting his mission over Cuba, a surface-to-air missile from the ground in Cuba shot Anderson down, killing him and destroying the spy plane. Interestingly, the Russians ordered the forces on the ground not to shoot down any American planes, but they did anyways. They acted on their own. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, responded with threats of imminent attack if any other shot at Americans took place. The tensions could not be higher, and peace was dangling by a thread. So what does the Aurora Borealis and Alaska have to do with all this? Now we have set the stage for one fateful U-2 flight that started near Fairbanks, Alaska, while the northern lights danced in the night sky in the early morning of October 27th, 1962. This was kind of the fateful day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This day was known as Black Saturday, because you can imagine how high the stress levels would have been in the White House. So why were U-2 spy planes flying around in Alaska? Well, between 1955 and 1962, the Russians were testing their nuclear bombs on the island of Novaya Zemlya, a remote island north of mainland Russia and about 1,000 miles south of the North Pole. Most famously, the Tsar bomb, which is the most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated, was ignited on October 30th, 1961, just a year before this fateful flight. Nuclear bombs developed by this test site were ultimately sent to Cuba, which started this whole mess. On the island, 224 nuclear detonations with a total explosive energy of 265 megatons of TNT had been detonated on this island. For comparison, all the explosives used in the entirety of World War II, including the 2 nuclear bombs used on Japan, totaled only 2 megatons. That's 265 megatons of testing on this island, and only 2 used in all of World War II. So needless to say, the US had an interest in knowing as much as they could about these tests on this island. Hence, an initiative called Project Stardust was underway, based out of Alaska. 42 U-2 spy missions were conducted from Eielson's Air Force Base near Fairbanks, Alaska, up to the North Pole to collect radioactive material using paper filters on the U-2 plane at an incredible altitude of 70,000 feet. For a little perspective, the airliners you and I fly about half that high, and my little airplane very rarely breaches 10,000 feet. These were at 70,000 feet. Of the 42 missions, only 6 of them found radioactive materials, and these missions had become a routine for the U-2 pilots in 1962. So when Air Force Captain Charles Maltzby took off from Eielson's Air Force Base that early morning, he was anticipating a routine flight that would soon be forgotten by history. Little did he know that he was about to trigger the most deadly war in the world had ever seen. Maltzby had flown aerobatics with the famous Thunderbirds. He was shot down in North Korea and survived 600 days as a prisoner of war in North Korea, and now he was dressed up in what is effectively a spacesuit and sliding into the cockpit of a U-2 spy plane nicknamed the Dragon Lady. It was supposed to be an 8-hour flight, just like all the others, but this one would be much longer. At 12 a.m. on the morning of October 27th, 1962, the very same day that another U-2 was shot down over Cuba, Maltzby took off on his routine flight. As Maltzby approached the North Pole, he knew his compass would be totally useless, as it would be pointing straight down to the ground rather than towards the north like we are used to. So U-2 pilots rely on older methods of navigation, the stars. By fixing on stars like Vega or Polaris, he could determine where he was and what direction he was flying. However, on this night, the Aurora Borealis was dancing brightly in the sky. Maltby was unable to get a fix on one of his navigational stars as the lights bounced around in his view. He did his best to collect the air samples from what he thought was the North Pole, and then he executed a reverse course maneuver. He turned 90 degrees to the left and then turned right 270 degrees for a completion of a 180-degree turn reverse course heading. However, without a fix on a star because of the northern lights flickering in his eyes, he was not able to confirm that he was flying the right direction. As per the routine for this mission, an air rescue plane departed from Barter Island off of Alaska's northern coast to intercept the U-2 and escort it home. Nicknamed the Duck Butt, this P-47 pilot promised to, quote, leave a light on in the window, unquote. However, Maltby could not see this light in the window. He could not see the rescue plane. The Duck Butt, the P-47, launched flares every 5 minutes to reveal the way home for Maltby, but Maltby still only saw black skies. Soon, Maltby noticed that the radio transmissions from Alaska grew weaker and weaker, and then he began to pick up music and chatter from a Russian radio station. And this was when he realized that he was dangerously off course. He likely recalled to mind when a U-2 pilot was shot down, named Gary Powers, over Russian territory. Powers survived, but it turned into a total political nightmare and an embarrassment for the U.S. And so for this to be repeated again was unthinkable. Maltby entered Russian airspace just west of Wrangel Island in the Chukchi Sea. This is way up in northern Russia. The Russians detected the spy plane and sent 2 Soviet MiG fighters to intercept and shoot down the intruder. Maltby could see the MiGs approaching from below, but fortunately they could only reach 60,000 feet, 10,000 feet short of Maltby's height of 70,000. Mayday, mayday, he declared over his emergency channel, and he turned eastwards towards home. Realizing his general location over Russian airspace, Maltby turned left and headed back towards Alaskan airspace. A navigator at Eielson's Air Force Base noticed that the sun was rising over Alaska, and he realized that if Maltby was close enough, he should be able to also see the sunrise and know exactly which way to fly home. But still, Maltby saw no sunrise. He was still far too west where the sun had not yet reached. The Galena Air Station in central Alaska picked up Maltby on radar from nearly 1,000 miles away. 2 nuclear-tipped F-102 Delta Dagger jets were ordered to intercept the Soviet MiGs and escort Maltby home. At this time, the DEFCON meant that the F-102s be equipped with nuclear-tipped missiles, meaning they would destroy everything within a half-mile radius. Meanwhile, Maltby faced a new problem. He was out of fuel. He was 9 hours into his 8-hour mission, and he didn't have enough fuel to make it home. All he had was 12 minutes of emergency fuel remaining. Maltby had no choice but to shut the engine down and the electronics off and turn his U.S. spy plane into a glider. Fortunately, from 70,000 feet and with a wingspan of 80 feet, this gives him about 200 miles of gliding distance. So as he glided towards home, Russian MiGs began a rotation to follow the descending U-2 as they also had fuel starvation issues themselves. By the time Maltby descended to 25,000 feet, jets appeared off of his wings. Maltby flipped on his radio, and he was relieved to hear the sound of an American voice saying, "Welcome home." Maltby had made it. Maltby was able to land at the nearest airport in Kotzebue, Alaska. The airstrip at Kotzebue was short for a U-2, which requires long runways. However, by deploying his parachute and the plane plowing through deep snow, the U-2 came to a safe stop, and so ending the near disastrous start of World War III after a 10-hour and 25-minute flight, the longest U-2 flight ever recorded. Maltby was so transfixed and cold he was unable to climb out of the plane. He had to be pulled out with help, and the first thing he did was shuffle over to a snowbank to relieve himself. Of the incident, Khrushchev said to Kennedy that the Alaska U-2 easily could have been mistaken for a nuclear bomber, which might push us to a fateful step. Despite the misstep of the U-2 mission from Alaska, Khrushchev blinked first. He offered to remove his Cuban missiles if Kennedy would remove his Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy and agree not to invade Cuba. The agreement was made. Khrushchev publicly commanded his ships to reverse course, being made the most humiliating moment in his life to publicly appear defeated in front of the entire communist world. Khrushchev retreated into obscurity and quietly dying just 9 years later. Although the average American's daily life went unchanged, historians emphasize how close we came to a nuclear disaster during those few days in October. President Kennedy played his chess pieces rightly and ultimately avoided disaster. Of this event, Special Assistant and Court Historian to President Kennedy, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. said, quote, "Now that the Cold War has disappeared into history, we can say authoritatively that the world came closest to blowing itself up during 13 days in October of 1962. And so we see that the Aurora Borealis began a slight mess up in obscuring the sight of navigational stars, and this is how the Aurora Borealis nearly triggered World War III.